The morning fog along the Aracourt road hangs thick as soup, through the narrow vision slit of his Panther Ausf. G. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann can barely see 10 meters ahead. His gloved hand rests on the traverse wheel, but the turret doesn't move. Somewhere out there, in the grey September mist of 1944, are American Sherman tanks, the ones with the short 75mm guns. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Hartmann should feel confident. The steel beast he commands weighs 44.8 metric tons. Its frontal armor, 80mm thick and sloped at 55 degrees, creates an effective thickness of 140mm, a geometric fortress that no American 75mm armor-piercing round can penetrate. Not at 1,000 meters. Not at 500. Not even at point-blank range, if the manuals are to be believed. The gun between his knees, the 7.5cm KBUK 42L70, can punch through a Sherman's hull from over 2,000 meters away. But Hartmann is 19 years old. He received 6 weeks of training before being assigned to the newly formed 113th Panzer Brigade 3 months ago. The factory-fresh Panther beneath him still smells of machine oil and paint. He has never fired his main gun in combat. The commander above him, Unteroffizier Werner Krebs, is 21 and has been with the tank for exactly 8 days longer than Hartmann has been its gunner. The radio crackles. German voices, tense and clipped, report movement near Hill 265. Someone mentions Shermans. Hartmann's loader, 17-year-old Gunther Schmidt, shifts nervously in the cramped fighting compartment, his hands already reaching for an armor-piercing round. They have been told what to expect. Lightly armored American tanks crewed by inexperienced soldiers, tanks that burn easily when hit, tanks the Germans have nicknamed Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter, lights, first time, every time. What they have not been told is that the men hunting them through this fog have been fighting since Normandy. That the American 4th Armored Division's Combat Command A has spent 3 months learning to kill German armor in the hedgerows and fields of France. That the Sherman crews waiting in hull-down positions along the ridgelines have developed tactics specifically designed to negate every technical advantage the Panther possesses. The fog that blinds Hartmann this morning is about to become the last thing many young German tankers will ever see. This is the story of how technical superiority died at Aracourt and how 11 Panthers learned that on a battlefield, mathematics matters less than skill, terrain matters more than armor thickness, and inexperience can turn the best tank in the world into a metal coffin. The autumn of 1944 should have been impossible. By any rational calculation of industrial capacity, logistics, and military force, the Third Reich should have collapsed after the catastrophe in Normandy. Operation Cobra, launched on July 25th, shattered the German defensive line and sent General George Patton's newly activated Third Army racing eastward across France. In the span of 3 weeks, American armored spearheads advanced over 400 kilometers. German units that had taken years to build were annihilated in the Falaise pocket. The Wehrmacht lost 150,000 men killed or captured, along with thousands of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces that could not be replaced. But Hitler's regime did not collapse. Instead, it pulled off one of history's most remarkable military improvisations. From the factories of the Ruhr, from training depots across Germany, from the remnants of shattered divisions on the Eastern Front, the German High Command scraped together men and material for one more counter-offensive. The target, Patton's overextended spearhead driving toward the Moselle River and the German industrial heartland beyond. The instrument of this counter-offensive would be the Panther tank. By September 1944, the Panzerkampfwagen V represented the apex of German armoured design. Born from the shock of encountering Soviet 34 tanks on the Eastern Front, the Panther combined the sloped armour philosophy of Russian design with German precision engineering. The result was a vehicle that, on paper, outclassed every Allied tank in existence. Consider the specifications. The Panther's main gun, officially designated the 7.5 cm KWK 42L70, fired a 17-pound armor-piercing projectile at a muzzle velocity of 930 meters per second. This high-velocity round could penetrate 185 millimeters of homogeneous steel armor at 100 meters, 149 millimeters at 1,000 meters. By comparison, the American M4 Sherman's standard 75mm M3 gun could penetrate 88 millimeters at 100 meters, dropping to 73 millimeters at 1,000 meters. The disparity wasn't just in firepower. The Panther's frontal armor, 80 millimeters thick at 55 degrees, created an effective thickness that American armor-piercing rounds simply could not defeat. Tank crews in North Africa and Italy had learned that the Sherman's 75mm gun could punch through the frontal armor of German Mark III and Mark IV tanks at normal combat ranges. But the Panther changed that equation. Even at point-blank range, a Sherman's standard armor-piercing round bounced off the Panther's glacis plate. The only vulnerable point was a shot trap, where a round might deflect off the gun mantlet and penetrate the thinner armor above the driver's position, and hitting that required either extraordinary luck or extraordinary skill. German tankers knew these numbers. They had been drilled on them during training. The instructors at the Panzer schools showed charts demonstrating effective engagement ranges. A Panther could destroy a Sherman from outside the American tank's effective range. This wasn't propaganda. It was ballistic fact, verified by firing tests at German proving grounds. What the instructors didn't emphasize was context. They didn't explain that those ideal engagement conditions, flat terrain, clear visibility, stationary targets at measured distances, rarely existed in actual combat. They didn't mention that the Panther's magnificent gun came with drawbacks, a hydraulic turret traverse system that was slow and dependent on engine RPM, meaning the turret couldn't rotate properly on slopes or if the engine was idling. They certainly didn't discuss the fact that the gun's long barrel and heavy muzzle brake created a massive dust signature with every shot, advertising the shooter's position to every enemy in visual range. But for young tankers like Obergefreiter Hartmann, the technical specifications were a source of comfort. They suggested that German engineering had provided a decisive edge. This belief was reinforced by the propaganda that permeated military culture. Joseph Goebbels' ministry had spent years crafting a narrative of Aryan technological superiority. German industry produced Wunderwaffe wonder weapons that would tip the balance of the war. The Vone flying bombs falling on London, the V-2 rockets, the jet-powered Me-262 fighter, and above all, the heavy tanks that no enemy could match. The Panther fit perfectly into this narrative. It looked the part of a superweapon. Long-barreled gun, sloped armor that gave it a menacing profile. The distinctive exhausts mounted on the rear hull. Photographs of Panthers appeared in Wehrmacht propaganda magazines, alongside breathless descriptions of their combat prowess. Newsreels showed them grinding forward across Russian steppes or prowling through French villages. The message was clear. German soldiers possessed technological advantages that would overcome any deficit in numbers. This psychological conditioning mattered. In the chaos and terror of armoured warfare, where decisions had to be made in seconds, crews relied on confidence. A crew that believed in their vehicle's superiority would fight more aggressively, take more risks. A crew that doubted their equipment might hesitate at the critical moment. The German High Command understood this. They made sure every Panther crew knew they were driving the best tank in the world. What they couldn't control was the quality of those crews. In early August 1944, Adolf Hitler made a fateful decision. Facing the collapse in France and desperate for units to plug the gap, he ordered that all newly produced Panther tanks be sent not to veteran divisions that had been ground down in combat, but to newly formed panzer brigades. These brigades would be equipped entirely with modern armor, roughly 45 Panthers and 45 Mark IV tanks per brigade. They would constitute a mobile reserve, ready to launch counterattacks wherever Allied forces threatened a breakthrough. The logic seemed sound. Veteran divisions had suffered catastrophic losses in Normandy. Trying to rebuild them would take months, better to create fresh units that could be deployed immediately. The experienced tank crews who had survived the Normandy fighting would stay with their depleted divisions and receive older, more reliable Mark IV tanks. The brand new Panthers would go to brand new units with brand new crews. This decision virtually guaranteed disaster. The Panther was not a forgiving vehicle. Its Maybach HL230P30 engine was powerful but temperamental. The transmission and final drive units were prone to failure if handled roughly. Drivers needed weeks of practice to learn the proper shifting technique, especially the notorious neutral steering that could snap the final drive if engaged carelessly. Gunners needed hundreds of hours to master the ballistics of the high-velocity main gun and the quirks of the slow hydraulic traverse. Commanders needed even more time to develop the tactical sense of when to advance, when to pull back, how to read terrain, how to communicate with other tanks in the platoon. None of this expertise could be taught in a classroom. It required experience precisely what the newly formed brigades lacked. The 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades arrived in France in early September 1944. Their Panthers came straight from the factories, some still coated in factory primer paint. The crews had received abbreviated training 6 to 8 weeks instead of the months-long programs that had produced Germany's pre-war tank forces. Many drivers had never operated a vehicle heavier than a truck. Gunners had fired perhaps 20 main gun rounds during training, compared to the hundreds that pre-war standards required. Commanders were often promoted NCOs with no experience leading tank platoons in combat. To compound these problems, the brigade's organizational structure was badly flawed. They lacked dedicated reconnaissance units, forcing the tanks themselves to conduct scouting missions they were ill-suited for. They had insufficient recovery vehicles, critical for an armored force, since disabled tanks that couldn't be recovered had to be destroyed to prevent capture. Their artillery support was limited. Their infantry component was under strength. Most critically, the brigades had no time to train together as units. In a veteran tank formation, crews knew their platoon leaders' tactics. Platoon leaders understood their company commanders' style. Company commanders could anticipate their battalion commanders' decisions. This cohesion took months to develop. The Panzer Brigades had weeks. But they had Panthers, factory-fresh, technologically superior Panthers. As the brigades moved toward their assembly areas east of Nancy, the young crews took comfort in that fact. They cleaned their guns, checked their ammunition loads, and waited for orders. The Americans were coming. Across the Moselle River, in the rolling hills of Lorraine, a different kind of armored force was preparing for battle. The United States 4th Armored Division had earned its reputation as one of the most effective American armored formations through 5 months of nearly continuous combat. Activated in April 1941, the division had spent 3 years training before finally deploying to France in July 1944. Those 3 years mattered. Unlike the hastily formed German Panzer Brigades, the 4th Armored was a thoroughly professional organization. Its tank crews had trained together for months. Its commanders had developed a doctrine suited to American strengths. Its supply system functioned with the efficiency that only American logistics could provide. The division's Combat Command A, under Brigadier General Bruce Clark, formed the tip of Third Army's spearhead. CCA had fought its way across France, developing hard-won expertise in combined arms warfare. Its tank battalions, primarily the 37th and 8th Tank Battalions, worked closely with armoured infantry from the 10th Armoured Infantry Battalion, tank destroyers from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and self-propelled artillery from the 22nd Armoured Field Artillery Battalion. This integration of different combat arms was the key to American tactical success. But the tanks themselves seemed inadequate for the coming fight. The M4 Sherman medium tank was, by the autumn of 1944, showing its age. Designed in early 1941 and entering production in February 1942, the Sherman had been built to a specific set of requirements. It needed to be reliable, easy to maintain, simple to produce in vast quantities, and balanced between mobility, armor, and firepower. It succeeded admirably at all these goals. American factories produced nearly 50,000 Shermans during the war, more tanks than Germany and Great Britain built combined. The Sherman's Detroit diesel variant could travel hundreds of kilometers without breaking down. Its weight of 30 tons allowed it to cross bridges and move through terrain that bogged down heavier vehicles. But its 75mm M3 gun, while excellent against German armor in 1942 and 43, was outclassed by 1944. The arrival of Panthers and Tigers on the battlefield had revealed the Sherman's limitations. American tank crews in Italy and Normandy reported that their armor-piercing rounds simply bounced off the frontal armor of the new German heavy tanks. Some crews in Italy had taken to ramming Tigers to get close enough for point-blank shots at the engine deck. The Army Ordnance Department had responded with the Mohn 76mm gun, a higher-velocity weapon that could engage Panthers on more equal terms. By September 1944, these upgraded Shermans were beginning to reach frontline units, but slowly. Of the 1913 tanks in the 12th Army Group, only 250 mounted the 76mm gun. The vast majority of American tanks, including most of those in the 4th Armored Division, still carried the original 75mm weapon. Some officers questioned whether these tanks could survive against the Panthers they knew were coming. The technical specifications said they shouldn't be able to. But specifications, as the veterans understood, didn't tell the whole story. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commander of the 37th Tank Battalion, was 30 years old that September. A West Point graduate who had trained on horseback before the Army mechanized its cavalry, Abrams possessed an intuitive understanding of armored warfare. He didn't think much about technical specifications. He thought about terrain, about combined arms, about the integration of tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power into a single weapon system that could overwhelm any enemy. Abrams had learned his craft in Normandy. The hedgerow country had been a nightmare for American armor, narrow lanes between thick vegetation, limited visibility, German anti-tank guns hidden behind every hedge. The 4th Armored had adapted. They developed tactics for using artillery to suppress anti-tank positions before tanks advanced. They learned to coordinate with P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers to strike targets beyond artillery range. They practiced fire and maneuver techniques where one platoon suppressed enemy positions while another flanked them. Most importantly, they learned patience. Veteran Sherman crews understood that they couldn't slug it out frontally with German heavy tanks. But they didn't need to. Patience and positioning could create opportunities for flank shots, and a Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate the side armor of any German tank at normal combat ranges. The 37th Tank Battalion's Company B, commanded by Captain Jimmy Leach, exemplified this professional approach. Leach's tank commanders had learned to use terrain to their advantage. They scouted ridge lines for hull-down firing positions where only their turrets were exposed. They practiced quick-fire techniques to get rounds downrange faster than the enemy could respond. They trained their loaders to keep a steady supply of ammunition moving to the breach, even under the most chaotic conditions. They also trained for something the German panzer brigades had never practiced: coordinated movement under fire. American tank platoons moved in, mutually supporting formations. If one tank encountered an enemy, the others could immediately provide covering fire while it maneuvered. German doctrine, by contrast, emphasized individual tank superiority, the assumption that a Panther should be able to defeat any enemy it encountered without support. On September 14, 1944, Combat Command A received orders to exploit the area around Aracourt. Their mission was to secure key bridges, establish roadblocks, capture supplies, and prepare for Third Army's continued advance toward the Saar. It seemed like a routine security mission. The German army was in full retreat. The war might be over by Christmas. But in the forests east of the Moselle, General der Panzertruppen Hasso von Manteuffel was preparing to prove that German forces still had teeth. The 5th Panzer Army, with its freshly equipped panzer brigades, was about to launch a counter-offensive aimed at recapturing Lunéville and destroying the American bridgehead at Dieulouard. Von Manteuffel had under his command 262 tanks and assault guns, a considerable force, enough to outnumber the American units in the immediate area. He was confident. His Panthers had superior armor and guns. The Americans were overextended, their supply lines stretched thin by Patton's rapid advance. A sharp counterattack could cut off their spearheads and perhaps even throw them back across the Moselle. What von Manteuffel didn't know was that Combat Command A had already secured excellent defensive positions around Aracourt. What he couldn't predict was the weather. And what he fatally underestimated was the competence of the men he was about to face. On the evening of September 18th, German reconnaissance units began probing American positions. Small skirmishes erupted along the front. Combat Command A went on alert. General Clark ordered his tanks to take up defensive positions on the ridgelines south and east of Aracourt. Artillery forward observers moved into concealed observation posts with clear views across the likely avenues of German approach. Tank destroyer platoons positioned their M18 Hellcats fast, lightly armoured vehicles mounting 76mm guns at key crossroads. September 19th dawned with thick fog blanketing the entire region. Visibility dropped to less than 50 meters in some areas. This weather would persist for most of the morning, a meteorological accident that would prove decisive. For the Germans advancing blindly through the mist, the fog negated every advantage their tanks possessed. The Panther's ability to kill at 2,000 meters meant nothing if its crew couldn't see 200 meters. The sophisticated optics meant nothing. The high-velocity gun meant nothing. Young crews with minimal training now had to navigate unfamiliar terrain in near-zero visibility, without reconnaissance support, against an enemy whose positions they didn't know. For the Americans waiting in carefully scouted positions, the fog was a gift. They knew the terrain. They had spent days identifying every ridgeline, every fold in the ground, every hull-down position. Their forward observers had already registered artillery targets at likely German assembly points. They were dug in, concealed, and ready. At 0800 hours on September 19th, elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade penetrated American outpost lines on the east and south faces of Combat Command A's salient. The German attack began with company-sized elements, roughly 15 to 20 tanks, pushing forward through the fog without infantry support. They were advancing blindly, having received no reconnaissance reports about American positions. The American response was immediate and professional. Tank destroyer platoons engaged the lead German tanks in running firefights. A platoon of M36 tank destroyers, armed with 90mm guns, opened fire at ranges of under 300 meters, their high-velocity rounds penetrating Panthers from the flank. The German tanks, surprised by contact, tried to return fire but couldn't locate their attackers in the fog. As the action extended toward Combat Command A's headquarters, a battalion of M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers, normally used for indirect fire support, engaged German armor with direct fire. The 105mm howitzers weren't designed for anti-tank work, but at close range, high-explosive shells could disable tracks and damage external components, even if they couldn't penetrate armor. Then the Panthers made their fatal mistake. In the confusion of close-range fighting in heavy fog, German crews lost their tactical discipline. Instead of maintaining defensive formations with Panthers covering each other, they began maneuvering independently. This exposed their vulnerable side armor to American tanks that had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Captain Kenneth Lameson's Company C, 37th Tank Battalion, was positioned on a ridge 500 yards from the developing action. Through gaps in the fog, Lameson's gunner spotted German tanks moving across their front, presenting perfect flank shots. Lameson didn't hesitate. "Mount tanks now," he ordered his platoon leaders. "I want you to move guns a-blazing in line formation with all guns a-blazing." 3rd Platoon, under 1st Lieutenant Merwin Marston, moved first. They rolled down the Aracourt-Rechicourt road, turrets traversing, main guns loaded with armor-piercing ammunition. Marston divided his platoon into 2 sections. Sergeant Morphew took 3 Shermans directly down the road. Marston and 2 more tanks moved parallel to the north, occupying a support position. At 600 yards, well within the effective range of the Sherman's 75mm gun against side armor, both sections spotted Panthers. Morphew's section identified 3 tanks. Marston's section identified 2 more. The Shermans opened fire nearly simultaneously. The sound of 5 75mm guns firing in rapid succession was distinctive, a sharp, cracking report, completely different from the deeper boom of a Panther's high-velocity gun. The American tank crews had trained for this moment. Their loaders worked with mechanical efficiency, slamming rounds into the breech as fast as the gunners could fire. The Sherman's gyro stabilizer, while not accurate enough for shooting on the move, meant that crews could get on target faster when they stopped to fire. The German Panthers never had a chance to respond effectively. Their turret traverse, dependent on engine RPM and slow even in ideal conditions, couldn't match the speed of the Sherman's electric traverse. By the time a Panther commander realized he was being engaged from the flank, identified the shooter's position, and ordered his gunner to traverse, the American tank had already fired 2 or 3 rounds. Armor-piercing projectiles slammed into Panther side armor at velocities exceeding 2,000 feet per second. The side hull armor of a Panther was only 40 millimeters thick, perfectly adequate against infantry weapons, completely inadequate against tank guns. The projectiles punched through, sending jets of molten metal and spalling fragments ricocheting through the interior. Ammunition stored along the sponsons detonated. Fuel tanks ruptured. Panthers began to burn. Within minutes, Marston's and Morphew's sections had knocked out all 5 Panthers they had initially spotted. The American tanks didn't stop to celebrate. Following their training, they continued moving, seeking hull-down positions, looking for additional targets. 2nd Platoon, under Staff Sergeant James Baresi, passed 3rd Platoon's position and moved into a blocking position south of the road. Following Captain Leach's orders, they were firing continuously suppressive fire meant to keep German crews buttoned up and unable to observe effectively. The effect on the German Panthers was devastating. Already disoriented by the fog, now under fire from multiple directions by an enemy they couldn't see, the young German crews panicked. Instead of attempting to maneuver into better positions or coordinate a counterattack, they began retreating. Several Panthers attempted to flee at high speed over rough terrain, exactly the kind of stressful driving that could damage the temperamental final drive units even if the tanks avoided enemy fire. They put those things in high gear, those Panther tanks, Captain Leach later reported, and they took off over a hill and disappeared beyond a big hill on the right. By mid-morning, when the fog finally began to lift, Combat Command A reported 11 German tanks destroyed in the immediate area. Most were Panthers, some were Panzer IVs. All had been knocked out by Sherman tanks using tactics that exploited terrain, positioning, and crew training to overcome technical disadvantages. Poor tactical deployment had exposed German side armor to Shermans that had used the fog as cover. The lack of reconnaissance meant the Germans had advanced blindly into prepared American positions. The inexperience of German crews meant they couldn't respond effectively once engaged. The slow Panther turret traverse meant German gunners couldn't acquire targets fast enough. And the psychological shock of being ambushed, of discovering that Shermans could, in fact, kill Panthers, shattered the confidence that had sustained young German tankers. The Battle of Aracourt had begun. Over the next 11 days, these dynamics would repeat again and again. The technical superiority of German armor would repeatedly fail to translate into tactical success. The material reality of warfare training, logistics, combined arms, air superiority, and above all, the simple mathematical reality of numbers would grind down the Panzer brigades until they ceased to exist as effective fighting forces. But on the morning of September 19th, in the lifting fog south of Aracourt, the lesson had already been taught. 11 Panthers lay burning. Their crews, the ones who survived, climbed out of their destroyed vehicles and began the long walk into captivity. Some of them were crying. Some were in shock. A few were angry, unable to believe that the technically inferior American tanks had destroyed them so easily. They had laughed at the Sherman, the 75mm gun that couldn't penetrate Panther armor, the lighter construction, the reputation for burning when hit. They weren't laughing anymore. Continuing seamlessly from Part 1. The morning engagement of September 19th had destroyed 11 German tanks, but it had accomplished something far more important. It had shattered the psychological foundation upon which the Panzer brigades depended. The young crews climbing out of their burning Panthers had been taught that their tanks were invincible from the front, superior to anything the Americans fielded. Now they knew differently. Word spread quickly through the German formations. The Americans had tactics. The Americans were waiting in ambush. The Americans could kill Panthers. By noon on September 19th, the fog had lifted enough for the XIX Tactical Air Command to enter the battle. P-47, Thunderbolt fighter bombers from the 405th Fighter Group arrived over the battlefield, carrying rockets and bombs. The pilots could see German tanks scattered across the landscape, some moving, some stationary, some already burning. The Thunderbolts made repeated passes, firing their 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets at concentrations of German armor. Among the American pilots was Major Charles Bazooka Charlie Carpenter, an artillery observation pilot who had modified his tiny Piper L4 Cub liaison aircraft to carry bazookas mounted on the wing struts. Carpenter's aircraft, nicknamed Rosie the Rocketer, was absurdly vulnerable, a fabric-covered observation plane that cruised at barely 90 miles per hour, now hunting tanks that could destroy it with a single burst of machine gun fire. But Carpenter had developed tactics for this unlikely form of tank hunting. He would circle at low altitude until he spotted German armor, then dive through whatever fire the Germans could bring to bear, launch his rockets at close range, and pull up before the enemy could respond. On September 19th, Carpenter spotted a company of Panthers advancing toward Aracourt. He made repeated diving attacks, firing all 6 of his bazookas in multiple passes. The rockets weren't powerful enough to penetrate a Panther's top armor reliably, but they didn't need to be. The psychological effect of being attacked from above by an aircraft that seemed to appear from nowhere was devastating to crews already shaken by the morning's losses. Several Panthers broke off their advance. Ground forces later confirmed that Carpenter had disabled at least 2 Panthers, one with a mobility kill when a rocket damaged the track, another when a lucky hit penetrated the thin engine deck armor and set the engine compartment on fire. The combination of ground, ambush, and air attack proved overwhelming. By the end of September 19th, the 113th Panzer Brigade's initial assault had been comprehensively defeated. German commanders reported 43 enemy tanks destroyed, mostly factory-new Panthers. American losses were 5 M4 Sherman tanks knocked out, 3 tank destroyers damaged, 6 men killed, and 13 wounded. The exchange ratio was staggering. The technologically superior German force had been slaughtered. But General von Manteuffel was not ready to admit defeat. The 5th Panzer Army had committed only a fraction of its available armor. On September 20th, he ordered renewed attacks against the Aracourt position, this time with better coordination and more units committed. The 111th Panzer Brigade, which had been held in reserve, now moved forward to join the assault. Fresh Panther battalions from the 11th Panzer Division were also committed. Von Manteuffel hoped that overwhelming force and multiple simultaneous attacks would prevent the Americans from concentrating their defensive fires. The plan called for attacks from multiple directions, forcing Combat Command A to defend along its entire perimeter simultaneously. The weather remained poor, not the dense fog of September 19th, but low clouds and intermittent rain that reduced visibility and kept American aircraft grounded for much of the day. This was exactly the weather the Germans needed. Without air support, the Americans would have to rely entirely on their tanks, tank destroyers, and artillery. At mid-morning on September 20th, German Panther tanks appeared in force moving toward Combat Command A's headquarters. This was a different kind of attack, more organized, with better spacing between vehicles, evidence of commanders who had learned from the previous day's disaster. 14 Panthers approached from the south, supported by infantry, and moving through terrain that offered some concealment. Brigadier General Clark responded by positioning C Company of the 37th Tank Battalion on a ridge 500 yards from his command post. The Shermans deployed in hull-down positions, their turrets barely visible above the crest of the ridge. From these positions, they had clear fields of fire across the approaches to CCA headquarters. The Panthers advanced into this killing ground without adequate reconnaissance. The lead vehicles didn't spot the concealed Shermans until the Americans opened fire at 500 yards. In a series of rapid engagements lasting less than 15 minutes, the Shermans knocked out several Panthers. The Germans attempted to return fire, but their crews struggled to identify targets. The hull-down Shermans presented minimal silhouettes, and their muzzle blasts were difficult to pinpoint against the background of the ridge. More critically, the Americans had the advantage of prepared positions and known ranges. Sherman gunners had already ranged their targets during the preceding hours. When a Panther appeared at a specific location, the gunner knew exactly how much elevation to apply. The Panthers, by contrast, were shooting at hastily acquired targets without time to range properly. At 500 yards, the difference between a first-round hit and a first-round miss could mean life or death. The platoon of M18 Hellcat tank destroyers assigned to shelter CCA headquarters proved particularly effective. The Hellcat was essentially a 76mm gun, mounted on a light, fast chassis, a vehicle designed to race to threatened sectors and engage enemy armor with its high-velocity gun before withdrawing. The Hellcats engaged the Panthers from concealed positions, fired several rounds, then relocated before German crews could respond. In the engagement that afternoon, Hellcats knocked out 8 Panthers, while suffering no losses themselves. By noon, the German attack had stalled. The Panthers withdrew, leaving more burning hulks scattered across the approach to Aracourt, but von Manteuffel was persistent. Throughout September 20th and 21st, he ordered repeated attacks against different sectors of the American perimeter. Each attack followed the same pattern: Panthers advancing with inadequate reconnaissance, American defenders engaging from prepared positions, German crews discovering too late that their technical advantages meant nothing against a competent, entrenched enemy. The fighting on September 21st demonstrated the full integration of American combined arms doctrine. Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by Captain Lamison, engaged German armor along the Metz-Strasbourg road in the early morning fog. Lamison's tanks disabled 3 Panthers that emerged from the heavy mist, but the real devastation came from American artillery. The 22nd Armored Field Artillery Battalion, equipped with M7 Priest self-propelled 105mm howitzers, had registered targets across the entire battlefield. Forward observers positioned on high ground could see German assembly areas and call in fire missions with devastating accuracy. When Panthers concentrated for an attack, they became targets for massed artillery fire. High explosive shells might not penetrate armor, but they could disable tracks, damage optics, kill exposed infantry, and most importantly, force tank crews to button up, sealing themselves inside their vehicles with drastically reduced visibility. Artillery also played a critical psychological role. The constant threat of artillery fire prevented German forces from massing effectively. Commanders had to disperse their tanks to avoid presenting concentrated targets, but this dispersion meant they couldn't achieve local superiority at any point. The panzer brigades were being ground down by the fundamental mathematics of firepower and observation. On September 22nd, Lieutenant Colonel Abrams led a counterattack to recapture the town of Uvalise, which German forces had occupied during the night. This action showcased the American approach to armored warfare. Abrams didn't simply order his tanks forward. Instead, he coordinated Task Force Abrams, combining tanks from the 37th Tank Battalion, armored infantry from the 10th Armored Infantry Battalion, and direct fire support from artillery and tank destroyers. The assault on Uvalise began with an artillery preparation. 105mm shells pounded German positions for 15 minutes, forcing the defenders to take cover. As soon as the artillery lifted, American tanks and infantry moved forward together. The infantry cleared buildings and suppressed anti-tank teams, while tanks provided fire support. P-47. Thunderbolts circled overhead, ready to strike any German armor that appeared. The German defenders, elements of the 111th Panzer Brigade's reserve, attempted to counterattack with Panthers. Captain Lamison's Company C encountered them first, losing 5 or 6 tanks in the initial exchange. but Abrams quickly maneuvered Company B around the German flank, catching the Panthers from their vulnerable side armor. In the resulting engagement, American tanks destroyed roughly an equal number of German tanks before the survivors withdrew. By the afternoon of September 22nd, Uvalise was back in American hands. The Germans mounted one more attempt to retake it that day, but the attack was shattered by the combined mass of Task Force Abrams's direct fire, CCA's artillery, and airstrikes from the XIX Tactical Air Command. The battlefield around Uvalise became a graveyard of destroyed German armor. The pattern had become clear. Individual German tanks were superior to individual American tanks, this was undeniable. But warfare wasn't about individual duels. It was about systems. The American system of combined arms, coordinated air-ground operations, abundant artillery support, excellent logistics, and above all, experienced crews who understood their doctrine, consistently defeated German forces that relied primarily on the technical superiority of their equipment. Consider the artillery disparity. American artillery battalions in Lorraine fired an average of 300 rounds per gun per day, a rate of fire made possible only by abundant ammunition stocks and efficient supply systems. German artillery, by contrast, was severely rationed. Ammunition shortages meant German gunners had to carefully conserve shells. This created a vicious cycle. Limited artillery support meant German tank attacks had to succeed without adequate fire support, which led to higher tank losses, which made future attacks even more difficult. Or consider logistics. When a Sherman was damaged, American recovery teams could usually retrieve it, haul it to a maintenance depot, and have it repaired and back in action within days. The 4th Armored Division's maintenance companies worked around the clock. Spare parts flowed forward from vast supply dumps. If an engine needed replacement, mechanics had new engines available. If a gun tube was damaged, armourers had replacements ready. The Germans had no such luxury. A damaged Panther often had to be abandoned because recovery vehicles couldn't reach it, or because spare parts weren't available. The final drive units that were prone to failure in Panthers couldn't be replaced in the field. The entire transmission had to be removed, a job requiring specialized equipment and trained mechanics. Many Panthers were destroyed by their own crews simply because they suffered mechanical breakdowns in locations where they couldn't be recovered before American forces advanced. The fuel situation was even worse. Panthers were gas guzzlers, averaging less than 1 kilometer per liter of fuel. In theory, a Panther could travel 250 kilometers on a full tank. In practice, combat operations, frequent acceleration, maneuvering in rough terrain, idling while concealed cut that range in half, and fuel was in desperately short supply. Germany's synthetic fuel production facilities were being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. Fuel convoys were being intercepted by Allied airstrikes. By September 1944, German armoured units frequently reported that fuel shortages were more limiting than ammunition shortages. American forces had no such problems. Third Army's supply system, though stretched by Patton's rapid advance, still delivered thousands of gallons of fuel daily. American tankers could maneuver aggressively, knowing that their logistics trains would keep them supplied. The air superiority situation was perhaps most decisive of all. German soldiers in Lorraine learned to dread clear weather. Whenever the clouds lifted, American fighter bombers appeared. The P-47s of the XIX Tactical Air Command flew hundreds of sorties supporting Combat Command A. They struck German supply columns, destroyed German artillery positions, and hunted German armor with rockets and bombs. German forces had virtually no air cover. The Luftwaffe was a spent force by September 1944, its fighters grounded by fuel shortages and diverted to defend the Reich against Allied strategic bombing. German soldiers called the Western Front Die Jabojagd, the fighter bomber hunt where they were the prey. This cumulative pressure artillery, air attack, fuel shortages, ammunition rationing, lack of spare parts, inexperienced crews eroded the panzer brigades day by day. By September 25th, the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades were no longer effective fighting forces. They had started the battle with over 150 Panthers between them. They now had fewer than 30 operational tanks. The rest had been destroyed by American forces, abandoned due to mechanical failure, or blown up by their own crews to prevent capture. The Germans made one final major effort on September 29th. Elements of the First Army attacked again, primarily against Combat Command B's sector. The 37th Tank Battalion defended Juvilliers a second time, but now they enjoyed superior numbers and elevated positions overlooking the German avenues of approach. The attack was repelled with relative ease. At this point, the 37th Tank Battalion was the furthest forward unit in Third Army. They had not only held their ground, they had advanced during the counterattacks. German attacks continued sporadically until September 29th, but 5th Panzer Army's commanders finally realized they no longer had any hope of recapturing the Moselle bridgehead. The offensive was over. The 4th Armoured Division resumed defensive positions and prepared for further offensive operations into Germany itself. The final accounting of the Battle of Aracourt was devastating for German forces. Of the 262 tanks and assault guns that 5th Panzer Army committed to the battle, only 62 were operational when the fighting ended. The Panzer brigades had been effectively annihilated. German casualties included approximately 700 killed and 300 wounded, along with hundreds more captured when their damaged tanks were overrun. Combat Command A's losses were modest by comparison. 25 medium tanks totally destroyed, 7 light tanks lost, 14 tank destroyers damaged or destroyed. American casualties were under 100 killed and wounded. The 4th Armoured Division had defeated a numerically superior German force equipped with technically superior tanks, and had done so at an exchange ratio that would have been unthinkable based purely on equipment specifications. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. For the young German tank crews who survived the battle, the psychological impact was profound. They had been sent into combat with absolute confidence in their equipment. They had been taught that the Panther was the best tank in the world, that its armor was impenetrable, that its gun could destroy any enemy from beyond effective retaliation range. The Battle of Aracourt shattered these beliefs through the simple mechanism of experiencing reality. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann survived the battle. His Panther took a 75mm round through the side hull armor on September 21st, killing his driver and loader instantly. Hartmann and his commander escaped through the turret hatch as ammunition began cooking off. They were captured by American infantry 2 hours later while trying to make their way back to German lines on foot. In the POW camp, Hartmann met dozens of other Panther crewmen. They shared stories of the fighting. Everyone had similar experiences. Advancing through fog or limited visibility, suddenly coming under fire from multiple directions, turret traverse too slow to engage targets, side armor penetrated by guns that weren't supposed to be able to hurt them, flames spreading through the crew compartment, the desperate scramble to escape before ammunition detonated. The American interrogators were professional and thorough. They wanted to know about German tank training, about Panther reliability, about fuel supplies and logistics. Hartmann answered their questions honestly. What was the point of lying? The war was clearly lost. Germany had no more Panthers to replace the ones destroyed at Aracourt. There were no more experienced crews to train the replacements who didn't exist. The fuel wasn't there to move the tanks that hadn't been built to replace the tanks that were now burning across the fields of Lorraine. Hartmann was 19 years old. He would spend the next 14 months in American POW camps before finally being repatriated to Germany in late 1945. He returned to a country that no longer existed in any form he recognized. His hometown was in ruins. His family had fled west ahead of the Soviet advance. He found work as a mechanic, eventually emigrating to Argentina in 1951. He never spoke about his brief career as a Panther crewman. When his children asked about the war, he changed the subject. He was one of the lucky ones. Many of his comrades died in their burning tanks at Aracourt. Others were captured but died in Soviet custody when they were handed over to the Soviets after the war. Some made it back to Germany only to die in the final desperate battles of 1945. A few survived the entire war and lived long enough to read histories that called the Panther one of the best tanks ever built. Those survivors knew better. They remembered the reality of combat. They remembered that the best tank in the world was the one whose crew was trained, supplied, supported, and fighting as part of an integrated system rather than relying on individual technical superiority. The Battle of Aracourt became a case study in American military education after the war. The tank school at Fort Knox taught it as an example of how combined arms warfare defeats technologically superior enemies. The lessons were clear. Training matters more than technology. Tactics can overcome technical disadvantages. Combined arms integration multiplies the effectiveness of individual weapons systems, and logistics determines the outcome of sustained operations. But the battle was largely forgotten by the broader public. It was overshadowed by the Battle of the Bulge 2 months later, where Panthers and Tigers would again face Shermans in even larger numbers. It didn't have the dramatic narrative appeal of famous tank aces or epic individual duels. It was simply a professional American armored division systematically destroying a German counteroffensive through superior training, tactics, and combined arms doctrine. The German survivors understood what had really happened at Aracourt, but they rarely spoke of it. In post-war Germany, there was a strong incentive to emphasize the technical superiority of German equipment as a way of explaining defeat. If only Germany had built more Panthers, more Tigers, more jet fighters, if only the factories hadn't been bombed, if only fuel supplies had held out, then the outcome might have been different. This narrative allowed German veterans to preserve some sense of pride in their service while acknowledging defeat. But the reality was harsher. German tanks weren't defeated because they were outnumbered, though they were. They weren't defeated because of fuel shortages, though those mattered. They weren't defeated by Allied air superiority, though that was decisive. They were defeated because the entire German approach to armoured warfare had become fundamentally flawed by September 1944. The pre-war German armoured doctrine that had achieved such stunning success in 1939 and 40 emphasised manoeuvre, combined arms, rapid exploitation of breakthroughs, and coordinated air-ground operations. This doctrine had revolutionised warfare. But by 1944, Germany had abandoned most of these principles. Chronic fuel shortages, limited manoeuvre, artillery ammunition rationing prevented effective fire support. The Luftwaffe's collapse eliminated air support, and the emphasis on building heavy, complex tanks like the Panther and Tiger meant that fewer tanks were available, reducing the ability to concentrate forces at decisive points. Meanwhile, the Allies had mastered the very doctrine that Germany had pioneered. American and British forces in 1944 conducted the kind of integrated combined arms operations that the Wehrmacht had executed in 1940. The difference was that Allied forces had the industrial capacity, logistics, and manpower to sustain these operations indefinitely. Germany did not. The Panther tank exemplified this German dilemma. As a machine, it was remarkable, powerful engine, sloped armour, devastating gun. But it was expensive to build, requiring thousands of man-hours and scarce materials. It was temperamental and required skilled maintenance. It was fuel-hungry at a time when fuel was scarce. And it was designed for a doctrine of offensive manoeuvre warfare that Germany could no longer execute by late 1944. The Sherman, by contrast, was exactly what the Allied forces needed. It was reliable enough to advance hundreds of kilometres without breaking down. It was simple enough that minimally trained mechanics could keep it running. It was light enough to cross bridges and use roads without destroying infrastructure. It was produced in sufficient numbers that losses could be immediately replaced. And, critically, it was good enough when employed properly by trained crews as part of a combined arms team to defeat technically superior German armour. This is the central irony of the Battle of Aracourt. German tankers laughed at the Sherman's 75mm gun, at its lighter armour, at its reputation for burning when penetrated. They called it the Ronson lighter. They were confident in their Panthers. And then, in 11 days of fighting in the autumn of 1944, that confidence died along with hundreds of young German tankers who discovered that their superior equipment couldn't save them from superior tactics, training, and logistics. The American tankers who fought at Aracourt didn't gloat about their victory. They understood that they had been lucky in some ways. The fog on September 19th had been a critical advantage. They knew that individual Panther tanks were dangerous opponents that required respect, but they also knew that they were part of a system that worked. When they called for artillery support, shells arrived within minutes. When they needed air support, fighter bombers appeared. When they suffered casualties, replacements arrived with adequate training. When their tanks were damaged, mechanics repaired them. When they needed fuel and ammunition, the supply trucks delivered. This systemic advantage was invisible on any technical specification sheet. It couldn't be measured by comparing gun penetration values or armor thickness or horsepower to weight ratios. But it was real, and it was decisive. The Battle of Aracourt proved that warfare is fundamentally a competition between systems, not between individual weapons. The side with the better system wins, regardless of whether they have the best tank, the best gun, or the best armor. General George Patton visited Aracourt on September 19th, shortly after the initial German attack had been repulsed. He spoke with General Wood and agreed that Combat Command A should continue its advance towards Sarreguemines the next morning. Patton was confident, perhaps overconfident, that the German counter-offensive had been defeated and that Third Army could resume its drive toward Germany. He was right about the German defeat, though the battle would continue for another 10 days. Patton's confidence came from understanding his own force's capabilities. He knew that the 4th Armored Division was probably the best American armored formation in Europe. He knew that his supply lines, though stretched, were still functioning. He knew that the XIX Tactical Air Command would provide excellent close air support whenever weather permitted. And he knew that German forces in the West were operating on the edge of collapse, held together only by Hitler's refusal to acknowledge reality. But even Patton was surprised by the lopsided victory at Aracourt. 43 enemy tanks destroyed on the first day, mostly Panthers, against 5 American tanks lost. The numbers improved even further as the battle continued. By the end of September, the casualty ratio approached 10-1 in favor of American forces. This was the kind of outcome that military planners had considered impossible when facing the vaunted German armoured forces. The Battle of Aracourt represented a turning point in the Western European campaign, though not in the dramatic sense of reversing the strategic situation. By September 1944, Germany's defeat was inevitable, barring some dramatic intervention, perhaps the development of nuclear weapons, perhaps a political collapse among the Allies. Neither occurred. The war would continue for another 8 months, but the outcome was certain. What Aracourt demonstrated was that American forces had fully matured into a professional military machine, capable of defeating German forces on equal terms and beyond. The learning curve that had begun in North Africa in November 1942, that had continued through Sicily and Italy in 1943, that had been validated in Normandy in the summer of 1944, was now complete. American armoured divisions knew how to fight, and they knew how to win. For Germany, Aracourt was yet another demonstration that the war was lost. The carefully husbanded Panthers that were supposed to restore German defensive capabilities in the West had been annihilated in less than 2 weeks. The newly formed Panzer brigades that Hitler had ordered created to provide mobile reserves had proven to be little more than targets for American combined arms teams. The gap between German propaganda about wonder weapons and the reality of exhausted, poorly trained crews fighting without adequate support had become unbridgeable. The material superiority of German heavy tanks, the focus of so much post-war discussion and debate, had proven largely irrelevant when those tanks were crewed by inexperienced soldiers, unsupported by adequate logistics, unable to maneuver due to fuel shortages, and facing an enemy with overwhelming advantages in artillery, air power, and numbers. Technology alone could not compensate for systemic failure. This lesson has been relearned repeatedly in subsequent conflicts. High-tech equipment operated by poorly trained forces with inadequate support consistently loses to simpler equipment operated by professional soldiers with good doctrine and logistics. The Battle of Arakout in 1944 foreshadowed the defeat of high-tech Iraqi armor by coalition forces in 1991, where technologically sophisticated T-72 tanks were destroyed in lopsided engagements by forces with superior training, doctrine, and combined arms integration. But in September 1944, these lessons were still being learned through blood and fire in the fields around Arakout. Every burning Panther represented not just a destroyed tank but the death of German confidence, the shattering of psychological warfare that had sustained Wehrmacht morale, and the exposure of Nazi propaganda about Aryan technological superiority as hollow fantasy. The American tankers who fought at Arakout returned to their maintenance areas, cleaned their guns, repaired their vehicles, wrote letters home, and prepared for the next battle. They had done their jobs professionally. They had followed their training, executed their doctrine, and defeated an enemy that was supposed to be superior. Some of them died in subsequent battles as the war ground toward its conclusion. Others survived to return home, start families, build careers, and mostly avoid talking about their experiences. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams went on to greater fame. His 37th Tank Battalion would fight through the Battle of the Bulge, where Abrams's tanks would break through to relieve the surrounded 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne. After the war, Abrams rose through the ranks of the army, eventually becoming commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam and then Army Chief of Staff. The Monet Abrams main battle tank, introduced in 1980, was named in his honor. Abrams never forgot the lessons of Arakout, that training, tactics, and combined arms integration matter more than individual weapons specifications. Captain Jimmy Leach, whose Company B had destroyed 5 Panthers in the opening engagement on September 19th, survived the war and left the army. He returned to civilian life and rarely discussed his combat experiences. In interviews conducted decades later, he was matter-of-fact about the fighting at Arakout. His tanks had been in good positions. His crews had been well trained. They had executed the plan. The Panthers had made tactical errors. The result was inevitable. There was no drama in his telling, just professional analysis. Major Charles Bazooka Charlie Carpenter became a minor legend for his tank-hunting exploits in his fabric-covered Piper Cub. He survived the war and returned to his pre-war career as a teacher. His aircraft, Rosie the Rocketer, was eventually placed in a museum, a testament to American ingenuity and the willingness of individual soldiers to improvise solutions to tactical problems. The German commanders who had ordered the Arakout offensive faced less pleasant fates. General Hasso von Manteuffel was reassigned and later commanded 5th Panzer Army during the Battle of the Bulge, where his forces again faced American armor with similarly disappointing results. He survived the war and lived until 1997, writing memoirs that emphasized the material disadvantages German forces faced rather than analyzing the tactical and doctrinal failures that had led to defeats like Arakout. The veterans of the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades who survived either died in subsequent battles or ended up in POW camps. The brigades themselves were never reconstituted. The Panthers they had lost could not be replaced. By late 1944, German tank production was declining due to Allied bombing, shortages of critical materials, and the diversion of resources to other wonder weapons projects. The handful of Panthers that did roll off the assembly lines went to other units, where they faced the same problems of inadequate training, insufficient fuel, poor logistics, and overwhelming enemy superiority in combined arms capabilities. The Battle of Arakout faded into relative obscurity in post-war memory. It was not commemorated with monuments or annual remembrances. The battlefield itself returned to agricultural use within months of the war's end. French farmers ploughed fields where Panthers had burned, planted crops where American and German soldiers had died. Within a few years, only the local residents remembered that a major battle had been fought there. But in professional military circles, Arakout remained an important case study. The U.S. Army's Armor School taught it for decades, as an example of how to defeat technically superior enemy forces through superior tactics and combined arms integration. NATO forces studied it during the Cold War as a model for how Western forces might defeat numerically superior Warsaw Pact armor through better training and doctrine. Modern military professionals continue to examine it as a reminder that technological superiority is never sufficient by itself to guarantee victory. The central lesson of Aracourt transcends its specific historical context. Warfare is fundamentally a competition between systems, not between individual weapons. A military force is not simply a collection of tanks, guns, and soldiers. It is an integrated organism with doctrine, training, logistics, command and control, intelligence, and combined arms coordination. Excellence in one area cannot compensate for failure in others. Germany had excellent tanks but failed at training, logistics, and combined arms integration by late 1944. The United States had adequate tanks and excelled at everything else. The result was not in doubt. The irony is that Germany had understood this lesson earlier in the war. The Wehrmacht of 1939–41 had been a masterpiece of combined arms warfare, with armor, infantry, artillery, and air forces, working in perfect coordination to achieve operational results far beyond what their individual capabilities suggested. But by 1944, chronic resource shortages, strategic overextension, Hitler's interference in military operations, and the cumulative attrition of years of warfare had degraded this system beyond repair. Germany retained the ability to build sophisticated individual weapons, but it had lost the ability to employ them effectively. The young tankers who died in their Panthers at Aracourt were victims of this systemic failure more than they were victims of American tank fire. They were sent into battle with inadequate training in vehicles they barely understood, without proper reconnaissance or combined arms support, against a professional enemy fighting on favorable terrain with abundant supplies and excellent doctrine. Their technical superiority was irrelevant. They never had a chance. On a cold November day in 1944, French civilians returned to their farms around Aracourt. They found the landscape scarred by battle shell craters, destroyed buildings, burned-out vehicles. Recovery teams from both armies had removed most of the wrecked tanks, but fragments remained scattered across the fields. A section of track here, a piece of armor plate there, shell casings by the thousands. The French farmers collected what scrap metal they could salvage and sold it to dealers. They filled in the shell craters and replanted their fields. They rebuilt their damaged homes. Within a year, the physical evidence of the Battle of Aracourt had largely disappeared. The land remembers nothing, only people remember, and their memories die with them. By the early 21st century, few people even knew a battle had been fought at Aracourt. The generation that had witnessed the fighting had passed away. The battlefield received no major preservation efforts. Local historians maintained records and occasionally guided tours for military history enthusiasts, but for most people, Aracourt was simply a quiet French town where nothing much happened. Yet the lessons of that battle remain relevant. Every military force that relies too heavily on technological superiority at the expense of training, logistics, and doctrine is repeating the mistakes of the German Panzer brigades at Aracourt. Every military that integrates combined arms effectively, trains its personnel thoroughly, maintains robust logistics, and develops sound doctrine is following the model of Combat Command A of the 4th Armoured Division. The Sherman tank continued in service long after World War II ended. It fought in Korea, where the improved M4 A38 model with the 76mm gun proved entirely adequate against North Korean 3485s. It served with numerous Allied nations through the 1960s and even into the 70s in some cases. Its reliability, ease of maintenance, and adequate firepower kept it relevant long after more sophisticated tanks had been developed. The Panther, by contrast, disappeared almost immediately after the war. The handful captured by Allied forces were tested and then scrapped. The French operated captured Panthers briefly, but abandoned them due to maintenance difficulties. No nation wanted to manufacture Panthers or develop them further. They were too complex, too expensive, too unreliable for peacetime service. Today, Only a few dozen Panthers survive in museums worldwide, preserved as examples of wartime engineering but recognized as dead-end designs unsuited for sustained military service. This fate, the Sherman serving for decades, while the superior Panther vanished, is perhaps the ultimate vindication of the American design philosophy. Military equipment exists to serve military needs. A tank that cannot be maintained in the field, that requires excessive fuel and spare parts, that is too complex for conscript crews to operate effectively, is a failed design regardless of its technical specifications. The 75mm gun that German tankers laughed at in September 1944 kept killing tanks for another decade in Korea and beyond. The Shermans that were supposed to be death traps served reliably in multiple wars. The American doctrine of combined arms, which German propaganda dismissed as mere numerical superiority compensating for technical inferiority, became the foundation for modern military operations worldwide. And in the fields around Aracourt, on a foggy September morning in 1944, 11 Panthers learned that reality doesn't care about specifications, propaganda means nothing on a battlefield, and confidence without competence is simply another word for suicide. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.